Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another fantastic episode of the SANS CISO Network. My name is James Lyne, and I'm the CTIO at the SANS Institute, and I'm joined today by two wonderful studio guests, one regular and one new participant that I'm particularly excited about. Now, I will introduce them shortly, but I am joined by Ciaran Martin, the director of the CISO Network, and Lisa Forte, from Red Goat Cybersecurity, a partner. Did I get the pronunciation right?
You did.
Nailed it. Fantastic. Always a good start to the day. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I just have a few quick housekeeping notes here to get us underway before we kind of stick to our very kind of well-constructed agenda. Some interesting cybersecurity topics, no doubt. First and foremost, we put together the SANS CISO Network as a place where you can share ideas. What works, what doesn't, the kind of things that are keeping you up at night when you're worrying about your security leadership decisions, and share with other people who have exactly the same problems. As such, it's very important that our members respect our code of conduct. Now, you'll find a copy of this provided here in the live stream, as well as pinned in the platform. And should you see any behavior that doesn't adhere to the code of conduct, it's important you notify our staff so we can keep this a trusted platform, a place where you can exchange those ideas. Now, event communications today will be handled in the platform. You can log in, you can raise questions in the network live, and our various speakers will take a little bit of time to go in there and provide a reply. Maybe not always immediately, so do make sure you check back in the platform after the live stream as well. Someone might chime in, or perhaps one of your fellow CISOs will have some thoughts to share as well. This is a rundown of our agenda today. We're going to be diving into the supply chain attacks in OT, which will be fascinating, a really interesting speaker, and a bit of a global perspective. We'll have some studio remarks, my two wonderful co-presenters here, and we're going to take a look at an interesting area in cloud, some of the top trends, some of the top threats and strategies for 2024. Seems boring in some ways. We're still talking about cloud at this point. We've been kind of talking about how it's going to be, industry changing for 10 years now. But the reality is lots of us are still struggling with this area. So an important thing to have on our agenda. Now, lastly, I will note, we do this for you as security leaders. It's the only reason to help you make life harder for the cyber criminals and better defend against your organization's risk challenges. So we want your feedback. Whether it's feedback on my pronunciation of Lisa's name, our speakers, the topics we should be covering that we're not, things you loved or hated, we will pour through this to make the network as valuable as possible to you. So through the course of today, please make sure that you take a moment to go through and provide us with some feedback. Now, I'm going to introduce our two studio guests here live, and I'm going to warn them first and foremost that I'm going to ask them to be prophetic about the kind of state of cybersecurity, what's happening in 2024, their big observations. Small challenge before we get started on the day. So I'm very excited to hear what they have to say and what we should all be paying attention to. First and foremost, I'm going to introduce Ciaran Martin over here. No stranger to those of you in the network. You've probably maybe met him at one of the face-to-face events that he moderates, the director of the CISO Network. But of course, not just a moderator. Ciaran comes from a pretty impressive background, the ex-CEO of NCSC, a long history in policy. And I always love listening to Ciaran because I tend towards the geeky, nerdy side of cybersecurity. And Ciaran always brings a perspective about how things will translate on scale when it comes to policy and people in the real world. So he often has quite different views to me, which makes him someone we should listen to, I think. And then, of course, Lisa, who's pronunciation of her name I didn't screw up entirely. Let me just mention a couple of things about why you should listen to Lisa today, and when she starts talking, I'm sure you'll figure it out for yourself. She has a long history in cybersecurity and in physical security, in fact. Physical security, dealing with problems with pirates off the coast of Somalia, dealing with counter-terrorism, a long stint in police cybercrime. But for the last 6 years at Red Goat Cybersecurity, seeing a lot of different environments, a lot of different organizations, with this real focus on preparedness and resilience. So I think seeing a lot of different places and having that upfront planning mindset is something that makes Lisa a really valuable kind of commentator on how to think about cybersecurity for the year ahead. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way for our two far more qualified guests here to share a few thoughts to frame the day for the CISO network. Ciaran, would you like to lead the charge?
Well, first I'll start with some feedback. You asked for some feedback. I mean, you said cloud, isn't it boring to talk about cloud? Firstly, you're on the wrong show. And secondly, I actually think you're asking for predictions for 2024, really looking forward to the cloud section. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, I think one of my predictions for 2024 is, in 2023, we all went a bit mad about AI, not just in cybersecurity, but in all sorts of different areas. And I think, AI in cybersecurity might be a bit like cloud on steroids a decade later, in that you get terrified by it and you say, this is impossible. What are we going to do? We have no strategy for this. We can't cope and so forth. And then over time, you reach some sort of equilibrium and way of dealing with it. We'll hear a bit more about that. But I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the introduction, James. Mostly, I will want to hear from Lisa and the other speakers, because we have, I think, 3 continents of expertise today, which will be very, very good. I was going to start actually by asking Lisa from the first to represent the first continent, although I know you're just back from Asia yourself, where you combine cybersecurity with extremely dangerous sports. So you had a busy 2023, and I was going to ask, what kept you up awake at night apart from dangling off rocks and dangerous places and in ice caves?
That's relatively safe.
And so forth. That's safe compared to this. So I was actually, to set the scene for 2024, this is our first big SANS event of 2024. I wanted to ask you what kept you awake in 2023 and what do you think the lessons of it are?
Well, I think one of the things for me that was really interesting was the ability of threat actors to rapidly progress and adapt to changing landscapes. And one of the ways we saw this, I think, so a lot of the work I do is in the financial services sector. And one of the things we saw twice, actually, was when Russia and Ukraine happened, we saw a large quantity of hacktivist activity, often quite sophisticated hacktivist activity, going after financial services institutions, especially in Europe. We saw a similar thing with the Israel-Gaza conflict as well. And again, we saw lots of hacktivist groups rising up and targeting organizations that had links to countries, or perceived links to countries, shall we say. And that became a really big problem for a lot of companies, because these groups are incredibly disruptive. And although predominantly it was sort of DDoS attacks, that's still for a lot of companies a big problem if your internet-facing assets are offline. So I think there was that, and I think the other side of it was the ransomware groups just gaining traction and not actually having the disruption that I thought we sort of were hoping that they would have in 2023. And again, I think that's going to continue into 2024 and cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, the ransomware thing is something that's worth picking up on. We'll talk a lot about resilience. Today, I do a lot of work in the university sector, and it's not a secret what's happened to the British university sector, but it's a bit niche, and so perhaps hasn't got quite as much attention, although it has made the New York Times and so forth. For the last 4 months, if you depend on the British Library in this country, you've been unable to access the main catalogue of 170 million items, and PhDs are being missed, book deadlines are being missed, authors aren't getting royalties. I think it's a really interesting and sad and disruptive indication of what happens when threat actors decide to go down a particular route, but also where there are real sort of resilience challenges.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things that's particularly worrying in the ransomware space is the sort of desire of ransomware groups to target companies in African countries, in South American countries. And the problem that that's creating is that they are refining their tactics and they're refining the way that they operate, which is one problem ultimately. But it also means that they're becoming very well financed because a lot of these companies are paying. So that obviously will come full circle and cause problems for companies here as well. And as you said, it's not just whether or not you pay the ransom. It's not about the data exfiltration. It's also the disruption that follows those sorts of attacks, which for some businesses, you're looking at days or weeks before you could be in really big trouble. Some organizations, it's longer.
Do you think, you mentioned hacktivists, you mentioned ransomware, so we're not talking about some of the top-end actors and so forth. How does this, in your line of work, how does this change things for you in terms of resilience, in terms of attack surface protection, other bits of jargon and so on? Because you're not always talking about the really, really top-end sophisticated guys. You're not talking about some of the most catastrophic outcomes, but it's really annoying and it's really damaging for some people and so on. And I find that sometimes, I don't know about you, but I find it sometimes quite hard to get my head around this type of threat that's just short of getting government's full attention all the time, just short of making the news. But my God, it's really, really difficult for people. I mean, one of the things I'd like to engage the network with and talk about it, and I'm interested in your thoughts on it, is how do you get after those problems that are more problems for you, your organization, and they add up to a big social problem, but in and of themselves, your little problem is not going to make the news. It's not going to cause a crisis meeting of the government and so on. So what does that mean for us? What are the sort of things you'd like to talk about and get people to think about to get ahead of this?
I think one of the key things, and we've seen this time and time again with the attacks that have played out over the last 2 years, is being prepared for those situations and having redundancy built in. And as you touched upon with the British Library and the impact that's had, thinking through the consequences of a certain asset that's really crucial to your business, being offline, being completely unavailable, forgetting data exfiltration, just focusing on the fact that you no longer have access at all to that asset. What does that mean for business? How long can you survive? What other things can you put in place to at least continue some of those business functions? And that's the key thing in a lot of these attacks, that actually it's about continuing critical business functions as best as you possibly can, as well as the ongoing investigation.
I sometimes wonder who's good at this. You do a lot of work in financial services, as you said. We like to think that the banks are really good at this, that they're good at seeing off attacks. We're going to have a session shortly on operational technology and supply chains and so forth. When I left government, I had, shall I put it delicately, some concerns about the level of preparedness in some of the more harder edge of critical infrastructure. I do think, perhaps it's a bit of being party pre here, I do think we're probably in a better place than we were 5 years ago. I think that's partly improved cyber. I think it's partly, because of the ghastly pandemic, we think a little bit more about supply chains. We think a little bit more about the wider, what the economists call externalities, about how your business works and how your organization works and so on. Am I being complacent? Am I being complacent, do you think? Or do you think there's more to go?
No, I don't think so. And I think you're right. The financial services industry has tended to be at the forefront of a lot of these developments because of regulation largely. But I'd also argue that if you look outside of cybersecurity, this sort of level of preparedness is being evidenced in other industries, like aviation, for example, having a lot of that sort of situation on, plane crashes and how you manage that situation across the globe in a responsible, transparent manner. A lot of these playbooks exist. They just need to be adapted for a cyber threat.
If I may.
Yeah, I was going to say, what do you think?
I'm curious if this is your perspective too. You mentioned the 5-year time frame. If I think about my last kind of 10 years, I've seen that transition from no resilience plan whatsoever. Like, I know I should have one, but I don't have one, to I've got one. But now I find a huge number of organizations, they're academic.
Yes, very much.
There are very few organizations that make that live and breathe and actually validate it works through practice. So then they hit a crisis, that resilience plan is the first thing that gets thrown out into, oh God, what are we going to do? So that might be that next stage of maturity. You've won the awareness battle for need for resilience, but not turned it into practiced action.
Yeah, and I think sometimes a lot of these plans are excellent reading, but completely unusable in a panic situation. And I always liken it to like trying to cook something. I'm a terrible, terrible cook. So I need the recipe literally laid out in steps, like really, really granular steps of what I'm supposed to do. And it's a similar thing with a crisis. If you've got this massive prose that's paragraph after paragraph, no one's sitting there in a crisis reading through that trying to work out what to do. So it's about working out those little things as well, so it's actually usable.
I'm a terrible cook too. You're quite good though, aren't you? So
I'm a decent cook, so we probably shouldn't use my mental model for resilience.
But it means you're going to keep the floor. So what's your 10-year horizon on all of this? I mean, we're going to talk about the future in a bit, but have we got much better? When you look at, when we talk about AI, for example, the experts say, will defense keep pace with the way in which you can use advanced computation for a much more potent threat? So in the last 10 years, have attackers and defenders kept up with each other? Has one outpaced the other? What do you reckon? You've seen a lot.
That's a good question. So in the feedback, in macro, I think there are some really encouraging changes in organizations and the cybersecurity industry to be able to keep up with trends. If you look at the position of security leaders, 10 years ago, we were moaning at, oh, I wish we had a seat at the table with the business. Well, we've got it now, and lots of leaders are going, oh God, how do I use it? So I think we've set ourselves up to be engaged in the right way. There's a lot of transition towards thinking about risk, supporting the business versus just technical activities. I've talked to lots of CISOs who, whilst they're panicking about AI, are in a position where they're carving out resource to look at it and try to work on it, as opposed to just being at 100% capacity and getting hammered by when a disaster occurs. So I feel a general sense of enhancement and proactivity in the profession and what we're doing as security leaders. I think on the purely technical front, we've never been in a place of having more tools and more technology and more capability, both as defenders and attackers. We're in the golden age for the good and the bad. And so it comes down to the team using those technologies. So I couldn't say, that the trajectory is towards solved or worse. I think we're tracking one for one. But I think that's a lot of credit of maturation of the industry.
Yeah, and I think I think at board level as well, there's more of an appreciation of cyber risk, and it's definitely something that's crept into those agendas a lot more than it did, say, 5 years ago. I think that's also sort of partly because boards are being held slightly more accountable, certainly in certain industries, for cyber risks manifesting now. But I do think that's a positive step forward as well. It's about steps forward. It's not about leaping forward necessarily.
Can't be complacent, though. You used the term before, right? We have some good changes there, but we've got to use them.
Yeah, and I don't know what I think, which is not very helpful for an event such as this,
but intellectually honest.
I think it's really mixed. If I think, let's take threat intelligence, someone that you both know quite a lot about. I think threat intelligence on the defensive side and the private sector sort of achievement in it is extraordinary. When I was in government, I just thought the government it doesn't need to bother with threat intelligence. There's so much rich stuff out there, particularly for the bigger players to buy and to partner with those companies. I then think some of the more basic things, domain protection and so on, it's got better, but there's a long way to go. You then end up with an important national institution unable to function for 3 months and counting in the British Library. You look at Australia's ports over the course of the Christmas period, and you say there's a very, very long way to go. And I think one of the areas, I did say that, supply chain resilience has got a bit better post-pandemic, but I think we'll be moving on to it shortly with Stephen. But before we do that, I'm interested in your views, because Lisa, like you mentioned, boardroom awareness and so on, and I think that's shot up, very significantly, unevenly, but overall, the rising tide has lifted most, if not all, of the boats. But the problem with sort of board awareness is you're very siloed. It's your organization. What are we doing? And then all of a sudden, it could be your West Coast of the United States service provider. We've seen these huge, zero-day breaches, supply chain software compromises of some of the core software. We've seen, maybe it is a port you're waiting for your crucial delivery that's been disrupted. And we've seen all sorts of supply chain ransomware disruptions. I mean, what are any reflections on that before we hear from the expert?
I think we were aware that the supply chain was perhaps a weak spot for a long time. I don't think there was a lack of awareness in the cybersecurity community about that. However, I then think the attackers cottoned onto it, shall we say, and exploited it to some pretty big attacks that happened over the last 5 years on supply chains that have been very damaging. I now think we are starting to put things in place that look a little bit more, as you said, it's about not being complacent and moving things forward continuously. So I think it is improving. But again, some industries have an absolutely enormous supply chain to manage, which is very difficult.
Any thoughts?
In some cases, the suppliers say, no.
Yeah.
You look at some of the physical cybersecurity devices in medical, they're like, would you like the device or not? Well, I'd like it to be secure. Buy another one.
Exactly.
Well, to tee us up, one of the worst cases, I know it's not operational technology, but it was still a big hit. One of the worst cases I ever dealt with of supply chain compromise, it was also ransomware, was the Eurofins incident of 2019, where a company that, frankly, I'm not sure anybody in authority in the UK government had ever heard of before, but it turned out that 60% of policing forensics capabilities in England and Wales were dependent on this Brussels-based company. So there you go. I mean, briefly, sadly, it was quite a good time to commit minor crime in this country, which shows you the real-world impact of some of this stuff. So it's probably time to go east and hear from our first intercontinental expert. So we've got on the line, we've got Stephen Sim. And when I think of Stephen, I think of the word pioneer. He has been fixing, breaking, and fixing again computers and code since he was very young. He's one of the first 10 people to do the SANS, the GX security expert certificate. He has 25 years and counting of extraordinary experience across all areas of cybersecurity, but particularly recently specializing in operational technology and in OT security. Has made a huge contribution to the community through his work with SANS, but also through his work in Singapore and elsewhere in building communities of resilience. And he chairs the OT-ISAC group, as well as his main job of being head of cyber at MNC, at Maritime MNC. So it'll be absolutely fascinating to hear from Stephen on what people are doing to how everyone else is protecting against supply chain attacks, but in that OT environment in 2024. So over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Delaney and Oli and the SANS team. The topic I intend to broach really is what you have been sharing about earlier on as well. The nth party, mostly third party risk. And it's the topic that is close to my heart. It is the risk that keeps me awake at night right now. Yeah, I don't have all the answers on how to effectively de-risk third party, fourth party, nth party risk. But I thought it would really benefit the SANS CISO community to discuss this topic. Hopefully some of my experiences and thoughts will resonate and trigger some of our attendees' thoughts as well. And I would love to hear success stories from the rest of the community that everyone else can learn from. Sorry. So we have seen the impact of NotPetya wiper through a supply chain attack on the seemingly innocuous accounting software some years ago. I think that's 2017. The huge damages of US 300 million for Musk, and the downstream impact to the rest of the business supply chain and the ecosystem itself was there for all to see, right? Laid bare for all to see. And we have also seen how Merck clawed back US 1.4 billion of damages from its insurer, which was exceptional. And we know that cyber insurance is not the panacea. We have seen Accelon, CCleaner, SolarWinds, Kaseya, Log4j, LastPass, and last year, very famously, Move-In, right, and many others, etc., causing collateral damage to a lot of end user organizations. And fact of the matter is that the likes of Cisco and the likes of Microsoft of late again have been breached. So what gives? If cybersecurity vendors themselves are also finding it difficult to defend themselves from data breaches where they have direct oversight, how are we as CISOs expected to provide indirect oversight over third or fourth parties, providing outsourced services, hardware, and software to us? Now, can third-party attestations help us? We have oftentimes spoken of SOC 2, that's a favorite, SOC 2 Type 2 attestation reports, FIPS 140-2 vendor TPRM risk scores from posturing tools, like BitSight, Black Kite, and what we have not. But companies are still getting breached. Can we say that we have done what is necessary because we have already checked their SOC 2, BitSight, Black Kite, and VAPT reports on an annual basis? Look at this web page on this managed service, which gives a slew of security practices. Are we assured, reading this, would we use this vendor? Anyone wants to hazard a guess which vendor this is? The redacted portion of this screenshot is the vendor name, which I've covered, and it's none other than Move-In itself, right? So there are many vendors who have attestations and certifications and still get breached. Even when we have questionnaires and checklists, such as CSA, CCM, CAIQ? Do vendors declare exactly what is happening on the ground or interpret requirements differently from ours? Personally, I've encountered cases where language ambiguity gives rise to misinterpretations, differing interpretations. Also, how can checklists weed out the issues of internal misses, such as vendors creating a 2FA bypass VPN group for the convenience of their own administrators? Ultimately, there's no skin in the game for them. Can we and how do we go beyond checking that vendors are doing the correct things to checking that vendors are doing them correct? Is it time to accept as a fact that no matter the due care, service providers will still get breached? How then do we also define due care, especially as CISOs, in terms of our due diligence? And what do we do when service providers get breached? Now, coming to hardware, let's move into OT. Can anyone recognize what this is? This is an AGV, automated guided vehicle, used to carry 40-foot long shipping containers. Some 10 years ago, I initiated and performed vulnerability assessment penetration testing on AGVs, VAPT, that my organization was evaluating and discovered undocumented developer backdoors. Sending unexpected input to the laser system panics the entire AGV and causes the vehicle to lock up due to its fail-safe response. I had to wave the ICS cert card to get the vendor's attention to resolve in the next firmware. Question is, do we need to do it for all our vendors? Are we, as end users, actually providing free VAPT service for the vendors? Right? How many of us invest in resources for testing every one of our essential off-the-shelf products? In fact, it's damned if we don't and damned if we do. Still on software, I shared earlier that all of us are aware that cybersecurity companies have not been spared from breaches. Even for cybersecurity products that are regularly penetration tested are also not spared from having issues. Above is just one of the zero-day CV I uncovered a decade ago with a reputed web security gateway, being able to uncover cybersecurity vulnerabilities with cybersecurity products that have undergone independent VAPTs themselves only further underscored the fact that VAPT and even SAST is just pretty much sampling and not foolproof. So do we still do it? Can our due diligence withstand scrutiny? If we don't, how much again is enough? Again, damned if we do and damned if we don't. And there are also geopolitical pressures. What if our OT hardware is already widely deployed in our environment? What are we going to do about it? Not sure if any of you remember the ZPMC cranes that were suspected to have backdoors. Most ports are using foreign cranes, right, including ZPMC. In truth, many products from certain nations are already widely used around the world. What are we going to do when a red flag suddenly comes up? And sometimes a new vulnerability becomes miscategorized as an intended backdoor. If all vulnerabilities are intended backdoors, then practically every hardware and software is suspicious. So how do we get assurance for products? Is there a labeling scheme that goes beyond IoT to ICS OT? How can we possibly manage such risks when they are already deployed? And I gather many of us at this stage would think of diversity of products to reduce concentration risks, but is that always possible? Now, on the governance front, there are no lack of guidance, such as the Joe Biden's EO and the UK NCSC guidance, mostly on additional checks and oversights for vendor risk management. NIST, for one, has issued special publications focused on improving third-party risk management and supply chain risk management. In fact, the NIST CSF has leveraged TPRM from popular frameworks such as ISO 27001 and COBIT to avoid excessive security control overlaps. These are by and large controls relating to visibility, attack surface management, independent audits, response, and recovery. But again, are these adequate? In my view, I feel that while the outcomes are clear, the level of prescriptiveness and maturity of controls need to be defined. And we know what needs to be done, but how can we effectively achieve that? Therefore, moving on, in the area of control effectiveness, there are different maturity frameworks we have probably all of us already have came across, such as CMMI, C2M2, and CMMC. Most of these maturity frameworks are based predominantly on NIST CSF. In my view, they go into more prescriptive details into how processes can be repeatable and sustainable. And for the purpose of today, I'll just quickly briefly touch on the C2M2 vendor risk management maturity controls. And it has, in my view, rather good OT coverage and a great toolkit. For the benefit of those who are new to it, for vendor risk management, it has 3 objectives and associated controls. On the slide itself, you see that the first objective is identify and prioritize third-party risks. And the list of controls from the lowest maturity indicator level 1 at the bottom all the way to MIL 3. And this objective requires, for instance, MIL 3 prioritization of suppliers and other third parties and have the list updated based on specific conditions. Second objective is about managing third-party risks. I'm only listing the controls for the highest MIL, which focus largely on tendering process. Bill of materials is definitely listed here, and it speaks about having cybersecurity requirements, selection criteria, and acceptance testing of services, hardware, and software. And not least, we have the last and third objective of management activities, which highlights the importance of well-defined requirements, having a clear RASI for performance, vendors having trained personnel, and continual monitoring and evaluation effectiveness. After running through these 3 objectives, do you think they are adequate? So back to my earlier question of how much do you care is adequate? In my view, some of these controls are still rather high level, and devil is still in the inner details. For instance, let's take the third bullet point for a cloud security provider. Right over here, the third bullet point. Personnel performing activities, have the skills and the knowledge. Are we going to get the personnel to share with us updated list of, get the vendor to share with us updated list of personnel maintaining the infrastructure on a continual basis, their certifications, and map against a specific competency framework to check against their job roles? How much oversight is enough? How can we manage this effectively? If we are going to invest so much resources into having oversight on third parties, then what is the point of outsourcing in the first place? Even with all these third parties, as I shared earlier, are still getting breached, unlike any other organization, even cybersecurity companies. Therefore, my take is that we need to come out with a benchmark of what the various industries are practicing and define what is acceptable and what's not. Ultimately, we don't want to negate one of the key purposes of outsourcing, which is really to defray effort and cost. Furthermore, most of the time, we can't get rid of the vendor who has pretty much monopoly. Let's face it, how many of us are going to swap Microsoft out because they have a recent breach? We are more often than not pretty much already entrenched in many of our vendors who had already integrated and interoperated rather seamlessly in an existing digital ecosystem, which makes any switch painful and potentially operationally risky. So my view is that we have to mitigate to reasonableness and accept residual risks and have the board understand we have done what is necessary as due care. Granted, business needs and insourcing may not be feasible either. So do you agree with that? But what is reasonableness? Is it C2M2? What is reasonableness to one may not be to another. We can say it is based on risk, but what is the yardstick or benchmark to measure your our due diligence against? So in the next few slides, I'm going to quickly share some observed approach that, in my view, exhibits due diligence towards acceptable residual risks in most industries. I would love to hear your thoughts after this presentation. I think it's very important to convince the board that we are adopting sound approaches beyond control and maturity frameworks. One of the approaches I like a lot is Microsoft SD3, right? Microsoft SD3 security by design, default and deployment have been around at least easily 20 years. CISO has been harping mostly on design and more recently on default settings, having the buck stop at the OEMs, the vendors. SD3 is generally, I believe, useful for supply chain risk across both service suppliers, hardware, and software suppliers. Increasingly, deployment is getting onto the radar because continuous secure deployment of changes and updates and architecting correct in the whole scheme of things is so important. Unfortunately, we all know that for OT, we have insecure insecurity by design with most legacy OT products. And to manage that, the security by design concept in the OT environment cannot be component-based, but ecosystem and network-based. And that's where I believe zero trust comes into focus. I'll share more about that later on. This slide focuses primarily on hardware and software risks. We are mostly talking about defense in depth and diversity. We have diverse people, process, technology solutions, and breadth in terms of layers of similar protection to disrupt lateral movement. Okay, so we have the depth and breadth most of the time, but less spoken about is defense in diversity. And to avoid concentration risk, especially with geopolitical tensions I shared earlier about, I think it's very important we diversify the products that we use. In the case of cranes, let's say in a shipping port, definitely we do not want to use a single crane product. We want to use multiple different types of products. And of course, there's a risk that when many products are used. One is interoperability. Second is the multiplier effect. The number of vulnerabilities we need to manage. How do we orchestrate all the configuration settings and fixes to a diverse set of products? And having said that, it is still necessary to de-risk concentration risk, especially in the OT environment. Therefore, a balance needs to be struck. Now the question is, do we review the vendor's architecture even for SaaS service providers, cloud service providers? At least the SaaS provider should show proof that they reviewed their IaaS upstream, correct? But having said that, if we use a specific collaboration platform such as Microsoft O365 or Google Workspace, it is hard to diversify without getting into integration issues. That's why multi-cloud is such a pain, right? So I gather there are some we can diversify in types of OT environment and some areas we can't. Finally, beyond SD3 and DID3, we have zero trust. Zero trust as a mindset and approach is truly important, especially in an OT environment, which I shared earlier has insecure by design components. It doesn't need to be an extreme of going right into the highest maturity of having exact TNA architecture put in place right from the start with AO2.1x aware switches implemented into OT equipment. Sometimes we just need to shield a HMI or PLC we cannot patch with a secure jump host. Protecting east-west traffic and limiting attack blast radius could be as straightforward as turning on the Windows Defender that comes with the Windows HMI. Not foolproof, but enough to mitigate against most attacks. And in terms of service providers, we should also limit the blast radius from third parties and be able to draw breach and continue business operations. And one important point I would like to stress about zero trust is assumed breach, which is often, again, another neglected yet important component of zero trust. We must assume that our OT network cannot be trusted and consume actionable threat intelligence, subscribe to CTI, ISACs, threat hunt, have adequate incident response, if possible, with SOAR orchestration, and deploy countermeasures as part of SANS active cyber defense, the UDA model, right? Observe-oriented, decide and act. While it is not easy to validate for on-premise environments of our own hardware and software, while it's easy to validate, right, for our on-premise environments, for our own hardware and software, how do we apply these to vendor environments? In fact, I've heard many times from vendors who have gotten compromised, assuring us that the impact is minimal because they adopted zero trust and limited the blast radius as a result. I applaud those feedback because I feel that this is positive. We can't prevent breaches, but if they can limit the impact, especially to the customers, I think that is very positive. I think we can all agree that all companies can be breached, but if third parties limit their exposure to zero trust, that's definitely assuring. We need to be able to draw a breach in an effective manner should third parties get breached and activate our own contingencies in our IR plan, in our response and recovery plan. And my take is that we need zero trust to truly limit the blast radius when third parties get hacked, and have plan Bs and plan Cs for business continuities. We need to run tabletops and red teams that involve our supply chain vendors at an increasing level. Finally, summing it up, I feel that aligning expectations with the board is key. Sometimes we really can't possibly have the cake and eat it. At the end of the day, we can't avoid vendor breaches. We need to appreciate the limitations, even with posturing tools as part of risk management. We can, however, mitigate the reasonableness, accept residual risk. Otherwise, if we can't fulfill the original objective of outsourcing, we may be better off insourcing or self-developing solutions ourselves. Throughout my slide deck, I think the big question is what defines reasonableness? What defines a CISO's due care? We require a best practice benchmark to use as basis to determine when enough is enough for TPRM and SCRM. In terms of how much, in terms of oversight into whether vendors are doing the right things right. My wishful thinking is if there is a mechanism to continually have real-time oversight of third-party compliance, not high-level, the outside-in approach that many of posturing tools does, yet trusted by vendors, that would be ideal. Until then, my take is that we just have to suck it up and mitigate, yet not overdo, to the right due care by adopting reputed control and maturity frameworks, adopt sound practices like SD3, DID3, Zero Trust, and Assume Breach. So I'm not sure whether you agree and what else can you think of. Now, I hope I've done justice to the short span of 20 minutes to get at least some of you pondering, and I do hope to hear your views and questions in the next period. I hope we can have more research into TPRM and SCRM best practices. I don't have all the answers, but I think having questions and discussions within the community itself will help to avoid potential blind spots for everyone. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you so much. And I hope that you're ready to answer what I suspect might be quite a few emails in response to that excellent presentation. I'm really struck by the deliberate, by the clarity of the presentation, but the deliberate ambiguity of your conclusion. You know, you had a wishful thinking, and then you said, till then, we've got to suck it up and try and mitigate things. And I'm trying to work out whether that's, you know, optimism or the opposite. So I suppose a question from me would be, to what extent do you think it helps to compel this? I mean, I'm from a government background some time ago, and governments think a lot about, particularly in the OT environment, when critical stuff matters. And now they're thinking about, well, that goes beyond, that goes into the supply chain. And you've mentioned a whole bunch of things that are really good and really interesting, and they mitigate and they will help. But then you said you need to get C-suite attention. Well, one way of getting C-suite attention is to make it the law or whatever. So what's your view on compulsion versus encouragement in this space?
I think that public-private partnership definitely has a lot to support what we're doing right now. Compliance and regulations are definitely necessary. And if, in my view, regulations and the labeling scheme that I've seen that has happened in Singapore and the US that has taken effect is really very positive and advantageous, but it's currently more focused on home-based IoT devices and so forth. If we can have more licensing and like our health labels that we have for food products, or a number of ticks that air conditioners are sustainable or saves electricity, some grading system for the supply chain vendors and providers, that will really help us a lot in terms of having that compulsion. I think that helps as end users, and you also helps the vendors because rather than having the vendors face a lot of repeated questionnaires asking about the same questions and over again. And we know that questionnaires sometimes do not do us justice. So having regulatory cloud into imposing certain stringent checks, not to the extent of common criteria, but adequate to give us assurance to the end users, I think that will help. For the board itself, definitely we need to share some of the benchmarks that we are already seeing. So one of the benchmarks that I use is one of the policy sharing tools, pretty much like BitSight and Black Kite and so forth. And we have specific scores for our own environments for our company. But if we compare with the vendor scores, the vendor scores are so low. So the premise is that whatever that we outsource, the security posture should not be worse off than on-premise. We don't just outsource for the sake of outsourcing, right? So if we are outsourcing, then there must, and if the security posture score is much lower, increases the chances of ransomware, likelihood of ransomware attacks and so forth. There must be a certain risk acceptance, and the board needs to be provided with that well-informed visibility into this. So to reach out to the board, we need to put in key risk indicators and metrics and share stories that's happening elsewhere. I think Moved It is a classic, and for the maritime, what happened to Maersk is a classic that is still being discussed about even to this date.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Stephen. I really enjoyed your presentation. I particularly liked the referencing to limiting the blast radius. I thought that was just such a great way of talking about resilience, and you're talking about tabletop exercising and the importance of that as well. One question that I had for you, but you talked about zero trust and you talked about assume breach, and you talked about the sort of positive impact that's had on your world. Is that the kind of key development that you think that's had the most positive change? And if not, what do you think's really triggered that?
Well, because the products that we use, the legacy OT systems, they're pretty much, a lot of them are insecure by design. So when NotPetya came about, when WannaCry came about, we have MS 1710, Microsoft vulnerability that needs to be patched ASAP. And a lot of OT, human machine interfaces, HMIs, they're not ready. They are not certified by the vendors to have that patch in without getting into some operational risk issues. And we have seen that happen in, I think, one of the Queensland hospitals, right? In their rush to patch MS 1710, the Eternal Blue vulnerability, they ended up crashing the hospital systems because there wasn't enough testing done. So having zero trust and limiting the blast radius, also from the assume breach perspective, is helpful because east-west traffic can be limited. As straightforward as really using Windows firewall, you do not need to have very sophisticated micro-segmentation solutions and software-defined networking, but just simply applying the concept to host-based firewalls can help a lot in terms of limiting lateral movement. What we have seen occurring in some of the breaches in other organizations is really lateral movement, not applying zero trust. And defense in depth in some of these organizations are an illusion. What we have seen and observed in some of the reports that through the ISACs that we have get to know about, some companies that have multi-layered firewalls, they segregate their IT and OT environments. To get to the OT environment, you need to hop through jump hosts, firewalls, IPSs, data diodes, and so forth, right? But what is the Achilles heel over there is their Active Directory. They share a common Active Directory. The IT and the OT environment share a common Active Directory for authentication. They didn't apply the concept of zero trust and limiting the attack radius. So when the Active Directory in the IT environment get compromised, it's a very common TTP for ransomware, right? Target the Active Directory and then compromise the member servers. The OT environment gets compromised as a result. So the defense in depth application of defense in depth was not really a true defense in that because of the bypass through the Active Directory.
Okay.
So having that zero trust mindset will get people to think about not trusting specific areas of network and limiting the attack blast radius.
Well, that is a good place to pause because we could go on for a lot longer. That was an absolute masterful account ranging from the strategic to the technical to the operational with some really powerful messages. And I'm afraid some of those follow-up questions that you'll be answering may well be from me because I have about another 6 or 7 jotted down, but we don't want to impose on your time anymore. So Stevenson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to the CISO network today. And we really hope we'll be seeing you again. Others watching, do get in touch. Keep the conversation going. Bear in mind, there's only one of him, so there are limits to the amount of questions.
Send me your questions. I would love to hear, get questions. Yeah, thank you.
We will absolutely do that, but we're going to move on. Lisa.
So we talked a little bit about what kept us up over the last 5 years and the developments and not being complacent and so on and so forth. But let's flip it to the future. What do you think is going to happen in 2024, 2025? What's going to be our biggest problems? Where do you see those pain points?
I think it'll be a mixture of the old and new, and putting predictions on video that will come back to bite you. We haven't got on top of ransomware. I think there is something particularly outside the US where either formally or informally organizations under a lot more pressure not to pay, and that's going to lead to a lot more disruption as we've as we've seen. I think governments and policymakers, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think they're getting more interested in trying to tweak the way in which the tech markets work for hardware, software, and so forth, and thinking about putting more liabilities on people. But I think partly that's because they're on to the next thing now about AI, and they're all saying, well, there's a lot of hype around this, but hype is often based in at least a kernel of reality. And so I think, one of the things in our sector, what is AI? You ask people in the street, even you ask some of the best experts in the world, as we had at Bletchley Park here last summer, and they'll tell you different things. It means different things to different people. I think AI and cybersecurity, that whole equilibrium, does defense keep pace with attack, will be the really key development looking ahead to the future. We always talk about we're going to secure emerging technology. Well, the tech that's been emerging for a while is starting to emerge, if I can put it that way. So are we going to secure it or not? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think pretty much the same thing, actually. I think that the problem with AI as well is that it's sort of in the public domain, at least. It's been overhyped in sort of both directions, I feel. Yeah. So we've sort of had, and this is going to come into my next question for you, actually. Okay. We've had the positive, it's going to transform everything and the way we do things in the world. We've also had, it's going to cost you your job and, all this horrible, negative sort of dystopian nightmare is going to unfold. And one story, and we've talked about this before, that I wanted to pick your brains over, really, was the drone story.
Oh, the AI drone, yes.
And I think this kind of highlights maybe a problem that we have with technology literacy generally in the population, but also the power, I suppose, of almost sort of propaganda that can go out with regards to new and emerging technology.
So, I mean, this happened, I think, on the 1st and 2nd of June last year. And I remember thinking, because I, like you, I like to give people what I think is a measured and realistic and hype-free version of security risks. And I thought, have I got everything completely wrong? Because I woke up one day and I think I was on holiday and there were all these news outlets all over the world, the UK, the US, and they were talking about how an AI drone had killed its operator in a military experiment. And it turned out then there were 3 retractions from the organization that published the story. One was at 7 p.m., one was at midnight. And, if you've ever issued a press correction at midnight, you're in trouble. And the other was at 7 the following morning, which said nobody was actually killed. It was just an experiment. Oh, it wasn't even an experiment. Someone was writing a paper and thought it might happen. The point of that story, I think, is not to embarrass people, but it's where else in human history, where else in human endeavor does such a crazy story get reported without anybody going, hang on, does this really check out? Because it didn't. Now, there are real security risks with AI, but that doesn't automatically mean that we should just drink any Kool-Aid and believe stuff that, I mean, my message to people, and I know you're very strong on this, is if something sounds implausible, it might well be. Trust your instincts, ask some penetrating questions. That's not a bad approach to cybersecurity. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's that sort of, we get into this sort of realm of sort of absolutism. And I know we're about to come on to a really interesting talk about threats within the cloud environment. But the cloud is actually a really good example of this, because when we had COVID and everyone suddenly pivoted to online working, essentially, and our businesses had to suddenly change overnight, which we never thought was possible and then transpired to be possible.
Turned out, yeah.
It was this realization, I think, that it's an enabler and it allows us to do a whole load of things, but it's not going to be this amazing thing that just transforms absolutely everything in the entire world without any drawbacks whatsoever, which is a bit similar to how we're experiencing with AI, right?
I think that's right. And it does bring us on to our brilliant next speaker, because as well as what you've just said, I think there was this time where we were terrified of cloud in the security profession, and you mentioned it, even almost as late. Maybe it took the awful pandemic to actually settle us down and say, look, we have to find ways of living with something that could be actually really powerful and really good. I mean, think how bad things would have been in the pandemic if we didn't have this. And AI obviously is a much bigger set of technologies than cloud, but we were talking about, you can't secure cloud and so forth. So
yes,
we now turn to the brilliant Terrence Williams, who, if you think about, say, a sporting analogy, if you look at somebody's CV or resume and you think, wow, played for all the major clubs, Terrence has been much sought after by all of big tech, currently at AWS, but a hugely distinguished career in the US Marines before that, and an absolutely central and treasured member of the SANS Instructor family. In fact, when you talk to people, even as far away as across the other side of the Atlantic, about his work, they say huge impact, but not just in the classroom, way beyond the classroom, in terms of not just his expertise in forensics and incident response and in cloud, but also just in community building and his generosity of spirit and openness and so forth. So we want to talk about some of the emerging trends of 2024, and Terrence is going to talk to us about the emerging Cloudscape landscape and the evolving and emerging threats and opportunities. So over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. It is an honor to be here. I love that introduction from y'all. That just set me up, gave me some confidence here. But yes, we're here to talk about that, navigating the evolving cloudscape, which builds on top of the technologies and threats that you're already alluding to with AI. So I am Terrence Williams, certified SANS instructor. A little about me is that I live by this model to innovate boldly, lead compassionately, and triumph together. The reason that is because my belief in what the cloud can do for us, where we're always leading to make sure that we have the latest technology. People are being able to innovate and bring so much good quality of technology to other people. But unfortunately, there are times that this gets taken advantage of. So we're going to talk about some of the threats that lead into our next year. Well, I can't say next year anymore. It's already 2024. But just you heard about me, so let's go ahead and dive in. We alluded to why the cloud has been such a big thing. There's this little thing in 2020, some virus sent us all home. We all came back and said business does not stop. I'm sure everyone here understands that business has to continue. So COVID-19 fueled this investment into the cloud by organizations. So we saw organizations that were not in the cloud become cloud native, become on-prem plus a hybrid of the cloud. We've seen those already in the cloud increase their investments, which does not shock us to see that 79% of companies face at least one cloud breach in the last 18 months. That is wild because we are coming to understand what the cloud can be for us. We notice the changes, we notice the positivity, but we're also seeing some of the negativities related to the cloud. Why do we care about all this? Well, the cloud is forcing us to think bigger, it's forcing us to continuously learn. Think about the cloud as the Disneyland for developers. Developers finally got their recreation to be able to design anything they wanted to without the limitations of the traditional on-prem environment. Well, for security folks, that makes us that chaperone at our kids' field trip to Disneyland. We're trying to keep up as well as put the guardrails in place, but it is going to be a hard lesson that we have to learn, that our training and continuous learning has to be on par or even at or even above what we're seeing from our developers. When we start looking at our top concerns for 2024, we cannot overlook how much the LLM Gen AI space has blossomed in the last 2 years. What we have to understand, though, the root causes are still prevalent. We have not gotten beyond the point where we are looking and saying we've secured the fundamentals. What we're seeing, especially as more people are generating code with AI, is that the cloud misconfigurations are still one of the leading issues that you're going to see in 2024. What that means is that 15% of our security breaches are starting with misconfigurations. That can be an exposed cloud bucket. That can be a API not following least privilege. What we are coming to understand is that yes, ransomware is attacking us. Yes, threat actors are getting more advanced, but we're still leaving the windows and doors open. So in our environments, we need to shift our security as far left as possible, meaning that when it's time to deploy the code, there's enough static analysis in there, just enough dynamic analysis in there, not just checking for the threats. We are doing a very good job of checking to make sure the threats are covered. But are we doing a great job at saying, when I'm using my infrastructure as code to deploy my complex environment, I have checked to see my misconfigurations are covered. My application security department has thrown out all these great lessons that developers are supposed to follow. Are those being dynamically checked? Are we relying on a human to catch those? That is going to be a struggle as we see these large, complex cloud environments that we're seeing. We're then leading on API security. 2023 saw a good rise in our security for our application programming interface. OWASP came out with their 2023 top 10 API security, and we did an amazing job at answering 1 and 2 for the broken authentication and broken object level authorization. That part we were knocking out of the work. The unfortunate part was number 9, where we see that the understanding of our APIs in our environment is not thoroughly understood. See what I did there? Most organizations, about 30%, can say that their organization understands and knows every API that is deployed. That means their external facing ones and internal facing APIs. Gone are the days are the APIs just here for machines to talk to machines. They are fueling our interconnected world. So as we are securing the APIs that we know about, attackers are leveraging our APIs with weak security, our APIs that do not follow least privilege. They are living off of the ability that 60% of organizations permit write access to at least half of their APIs. So what does that mean? You most likely in your environment have an API that you are unaware of that does not follow least privilege, has weaker authentication, and allows write access inside of your environment. That is going to lead to the ransomware attacks, where attackers are sitting on the internet waiting for you to expose these APIs. This also is being fueled by the LLM boom right now. As you're developing more applications, you're developing more APIs to interact with those applications, and this is going to lead to more coverage. Right now, we need to be more dynamic when it comes to securing our APIs. We need to make sure that they're being designed with security mindset upfront, meaning that before they're even launched to production, we're looking at what do we need in that API? Does it have all the correct header information for us to properly log, for us to properly secure and understand who and what access that API? Are the privileges to the API locked down to what they need to be? If those are not being answered, you are most likely leaving yourself exposed to those later down the line attacks that we are already fearing. Then, on top of all of this, we have come to this interconnected world where we have multi-cloud environments. Yes, you're probably using the big three, but there's also more smaller cloud environments that are also interconnected now. So across this multi-cloud environment, you have identities that are being utilized for more than one application. They're being overused, they're being exposed. 82% of all those data breaches that we've been worried about for the last year involve some human error or credential theft. So we need to make sure that we are having an identity store that is compatible with all of our cloud infrastructure that we're deploying in our environment. This is going to make it better for your security team to be able to go in and identify the who, what, when, where, and how of the breach that they're investigating. We had a few honorable mentions because we had to draw the line for top three. The top three before were mostly around the root causes that can lead to further on breaches. Now we want to talk about at least two other honorable mentions that are going to help us understand the landscape leading into 2024. As you are probably aware, the supply chain compromises have boomed in the last few years. According to CrowdStrike's definition of a supply chain compromise, we're looking at a third party vendor that is supplying us a supply chain, which is underlying software that is interconnecting into our environment, but that third party vendor is the one that is getting compromised. Unfortunately, we are not able to understand their security because we are doing well at putting our oxygen mask on first. So our environments have become very hardened. We have deterred attackers from saying, I want to spend a year going after your one environment. What they have learned is I can go find these vendors that have downstream customers, thousands of customers, to where their internal investment is going to allow them to get more bang for their buck. And this has been seen in Log4j, SolarWinds, and the recent movement. These type of supply chain compromises are going to continue to hurt us because it is nearly impossible to ensure the interior of your vendors are going to be as secure as your environment. What does this mean for us? Well, you need to vet what your third party vendor is doing, but you also need to understand what is their normal with inside of your environment. Typically, we have taken the negative security approach, meaning that we're looking for all the bads that can go wrong and making a database of all the potential bads that we have. So we do our tabletops, we do our threat landscapes, we do everything to say what can go wrong. Well, when it comes to supply chain compromises, we need to understand what is it supposed to do. That positive security mindset is going to say, if I know the good, I can then detect the bad. This allows us to become more dynamic by using features like machine learning that are now set up to understand when our third party application has deviated from their known good. Can we get rid of supply chain compromise? Unfortunately, no, we can't. We've seen SaaS applications or the software as a service platforms are offering us technology that would take us years to develop ourselves. So we are relying on these platforms. Unfortunately, there were about 30 breaches in 2023 that have impacted over 221 million individuals. What does this mean for us? We need to make sure that we are auditing our third party SaaS applications. We need to understand when patches are rolling out, how do you apply them effectively? I understand the majority of environments have a methodical approach to understand what a patch is supposed to do for a third party. Well, we need to be able to move as fast as an attacker to understand what that is going to be impacting. Unfortunately, in our interconnected world, we also have our code dependencies. Probably about 10 years ago, we could easily trace the chain of code dependencies. Now it's unfortunate that most of our software applications have code dependencies that are 10 layers So we are not aware of some potential threat because of an open source library that was used by a third party vendor of our third party vendor of their third party vendor. So we have to be cognizant of what we're allowing in our environment. The same level of scrutiny that we're applying to our code that we are deploying, we have to apply to that code being introduced into our environment. Again, going back to that positive security mindset, we want to understand, what is it normally supposed to do? Is this code supposed to have the access that is performing? So I give this third party library access to an internal HR system. Before, it was only designed to give me metrics about my employees. Now it's going through and pulling details about employee bank information. Can we detect that? That is what's going to help us stay ahead of our supply chain compromises by understanding. Of course, when the issue has occurred, we do want to make sure that we already adopted forward-leaning models like the zero trust model. But unfortunately, we cannot always say by the time the supply chain compromise has happened, they're the ones telling us. Typically, as a corporation, you're going back to your third-party vendor and asking them, why is your software application performing like this? And that is how they're coming back to say, oh, wow, there is something happening. We do need to investigate. And then we understand the full brevity of the compromise. Lastly, when we talked about the multi-cloud environments, we did talk about having identity stores that are going to allow you to manage your identities more centrally. These are also at risk. We've seen in the past year a few identity stores that have had their compromises that have led to downstream compromises. We need to be aware of what our identity stores are doing because they are crucial to our environment, where someone is now able to come into your environment and have the privileges that all your other users are going to be having within your environment. Next honorable mention is going to be around the cloud native malware and some advanced threats. Attackers are getting much better at the cloud than we are. Unfortunately, we used to depend on the on-prem model. On-prem model, attackers only can look at their niche environment that they say, I'm only targeting organizations in this umbrella because you're going to run the same technology stack, you're going to have similar software. I know what your environment should have. Well, in the cloud, I can go spin up my own cloud environment, understand the cloud just as well as you, and then go into your environment where then I can then start masquerading as a regular user in the cloud. So your security teams are going to be chasing technology that looks like it was theirs. It is not uncommon for attackers to mimic what's going on in your environment and launch those same similar techniques that you have. And you're just looking at it and saying, oh, yeah, that's normal in our environment. This goes back to our inventory of APIs. What are they doing? How are they performing? Another key challenge that we're going to see is the rise of the storage bucket malware. There are multifacets on why we care about the malware and storage buckets. One primary one is going to be someone staging their malware inside of your environment. We need to be able to detect this. We need to be able to scan inside of our storage buckets to understand what is in there. But most important, the most important point is that we need to be encrypting our data at rest and in transit. So if you are storing sensitive data in that bucket, someone with their malware that is now cloud native, leveraging the APIs of the cloud, they're going to traverse your storage to get these unencrypted data and expose them. We recently just had the article about the mother of all breaches, and that is going to most likely come back to someone not securing their storage properly and exposing all of their data. The cloud attacks are becoming a lot more targeted. Attackers understand your organization is in the cloud, and they are going to begin to start targeting you as if you're in the cloud. Your cloud infrastructure will be indistinguishable from others, and they will take advantage of that. So to bring this to a head, we had some of the top 3 points that we talked about. misconfigurations, our API security, and our identity management in multi-cloud environments. A lot of this is going to be dependent on us auditing our environments routinely. That means both statically as code is being produced and dynamically. This could look as code being tested in your pipeline, but all the way going to like a bug bounty program to allow people on your side to find your breaches before an attacker finds your breaches. The honorable mentions of the supply chain compromises, we need to continuously audit our third-party vendors. We need to treat them with the same level of scrutiny that we treat our internal applications. We need to audit, making sure that we understand their normals, and that way we can understand when it's no longer acting normal. And then we have to be aware that the cloud is now no longer the next frontier. It is the place that everyone knows you're at. So you're going to see more targeted malware. You're going to see more advanced threats that are leveraging the cloud technology against you as attackers are learning it as fast as we are learning it. So we need to be proactive. We need to lean in. We have to have our forward thinking security strategies. It is going to be essential that we're no longer relying on on-prem strategies of the hard exterior squishy center. We need to adopt the zero trust. We need to understand that people are going to be people. We need to train our people. We need to make sure that everyone's part of our security program. We cannot have our smaller security teams adopting all of security for everyone, because all members need to buy in, because all members are going to be contributing to why a breach occurred. And one thing I cannot leave out is our continuous learning. Our security teams already have smaller teams compared to their developer counterparts. So that continuous learning to keep them on par, keep their cloud skills up to date, keeping their security skills up to date is going to be vital to making sure that we're prepared for 2024. So that brings me to the end. I want to say thank y'all for having me at the CISO Network for this presentation. I look forward to connecting and any question that you may have.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you. I can see why you've got such a strong reputation as a SANS instructor at Terrence. And I love the idea of honorable mentions and some of the techniques. I tried to interest SANS in the idea of perhaps, APT of the year or, hack of the year and so forth. But I think your idea is much better. But so I'm sure you'll be inundated with questions from people watching and in your subsequent engagements with SANS. But I had a question. I'm trying to frame something on behalf of the watching CISOs that you can't see, which is that last slide and all the rest of the brilliant presentation. Really sensible, great analysis. And then you give us a list of things, many of which are the core principles and practices of, say, zero trust and other key concepts. But you say, look, here's the things, this 6, 7 things you need to be thinking about and doing. The question back will be, how easy is it to do all of these? How realistic is it to do all of these? What are the practical implementation difficulties that you might foresee and you might be able to help people overcome?
That's a great question. This is one of the areas where it is going to be different. Unfortunately, we cannot just wave a wand and say you can deploy all these strategies today. The biggest thing you have to face is getting the buy-in from your entire company of security. Because if you are developing this API security strategy, but your development team is not buying into making sure that your APIs are meeting the standards, you are no longer actually implementing an API security strategy. All you're doing is having a best wish. So the buy-in is going to be essential to get your employees on board across the board. Then once you start getting the buy-in, you will find that you need to take a phase approach. As you deploy in the cloud, it should not be as rapid as the cloud is going to be updating. You need to understand that your adoption of the cloud, of their new technologies, on how they're going to deploy them, needs to be in a phase approach. During the phase approaches, start with your security team. What does your security team understand when you are beta testing your new designs? Make sure the people who are going to be enforcing it are some of the first people in front of it, because they'll be able to let you know this works the way you thought it works, and this piece is wishful thinking. That will allow you to get to the larger organization with less roadblocks when people are coming back saying, this doesn't make sense to me. So that phase approach is going to be what you're going to look at. It's going to be years of development. You will not have something that you can deploy in a quarter, but you need to understand that without the buy-in, there's not much you will be able to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think one of the things for me watching your presentation was, and we sort of talked about it at the beginning, the first speaker also talked about it, which was this tendency, I think, of human beings to become a little bit complacent. I've done this, I've understood this, so now I'm fine with it, and I can just carry on, infinitely in this trajectory. And I think one of the things you touched upon was about continuous learning, and also mistakes. You talked about encryption, and you talked about, clearly these are things that can be, people can make mistakes with easily in the configuration of whatever they're using. So when you talk about, the need for continuous learning, what's the sort of strategy that people can look at employing? Because it's one thing to just say, well, you need to embark upon a journey of continuous learning, but what does that actually look like?
Yes, so continuous learning takes multiple forms, but some of the best continuous learning are going to be the hands-on learning, especially in the cloud when you could develop your own test environments that allow people to get in and have their hands on to not only see what the consequences of their actions are, but understand how to implement the right strategies. Yes, we can send everyone to training, but unfortunately, sometimes training is not always feasible because of our time constraints. So, what you want to do is make sure that your security teams are implementing training that's more interactive. So, things going out to the broader org is a little more than just the questions. You have some interactive forums that allow people to have choices, understand how their choice impacts the next decision that's going to be made. The continuous learning is going to be more of a micro dose. So you may not be able to have one wide arching training that covers everything you need, but every quarter someone gets a new small training that's focused on how do you deploy the correct API. So they go through their training, they deploy a test API that's fully secure, and they have the mechanisms to be able to understand it, be able to document it themselves, experiment, because everyone does not learn the same. So allowing that hands-on environment to allow people to interact through their own thought process is going to be how you connect with them better, and it encourages them to keep learning, because if you connect with me on the way that I learn versus connecting with me the way you learn, I'm much more engaged to participate in the training.
A final one from me, Terrence. I was really interested in that same part of the presentation that Lisa just focused on around things like the number of, I think it was 15% you mentioned were configuration errors. Then you said that 60% of APIs had, or 60% of users had write access in APIs. And part of me wants to give people the benefit of the doubt here and say, look, they're not being stupid, they're not being willful, malevolent, or lazy. There are good business reasons for this. Either we've made it too hard for them, maybe that's the problem in configuration errors, or there's a good business reason why so many people need write accesses. I mean, what do you think about all of that? Are there really important organizational incentive human factors at play here that we need to think a little bit more about? And if so, what are they?
Yes, human beings are going to be human beings. We do make our mistakes. What we have to understand from security is that our guardrails should be in place, but they should not be something that's challenging users. What you'll find are humans are going to say, if you box me into this corner, I want to find my solution. So if you put too stringent of policies in place, too stringent of guardrails, they're going to be creative to then go figure out the solution to meet their deadlines, to make sure that their project did not slip behind the quota that they said they're going to be. So what we have to approach it is we need to set them up to be great. If you're going to say, I want my program to make sure that our misconfigurations are caught ahead of time, how can we integrate that into the pipeline? How can our code reviews be dynamically analyzing the different pieces that we want to enforce versus making sure that everyone has this long document to read for each and every single security issue that they want? It's great to educate our users. and they do take the time, but we also got to understand there's only 24 hours in a day. So in those 24 hours in a day, we are asking our employees to do so much. And on top of their roles, we're asking them to add more security. We need to take the approach of saying, how can we integrate security into your work to where you're worried about doing your role and your job at the best of your abilities, and we will worry about security. We're going to scale security to meet your needs versus asking people to run very fast to deploy something, but stop at the door when security comes in. So enabling our users to be security minded, enabling them to understand why this is important, is going to build a partnership that we usually don't see in security, where we come more from a dictatorship, but it should be a partner. We want them to work with us the same way we want to work with them.
Fantastic. Well, look, there's so much more we could talk about, but we're pressed for time and don't want to abuse your time. So thank you so much. I suspect some people will be watching that presentation more than once. So much in there. Really rich. A brilliant presentation from Singapore, now a brilliant one from the US. So we're now going to go back to the UK. Thank you so much, Terrence. James, you're back. My head is too full of cybersecurity goodness to go on. So could you just take over and see us home, please?
I certainly can. Well, firstly, I'd love to thank Terrence and Stephen and Lisa and yourself for a fantastic agenda today. I think a lot of really interesting, applicable ideas, and in the midst of a lot of pretty significant and disruptive technology trends, quite a lot of hype. There's always a lot of hype, but maybe more than usual. I think quite a lot of pragmatism in there on where to focus. I am going to wrap up momentarily with a few more housekeeping notes, but before I do that, I just think from today, if you could pick one thing for our CISOs to pay attention to, whether it's a piece of advice, a developing trend, an idea where you went, oh, that's just brilliant. I'd love to ask each of you what you'd pick as your one thing to tell the audience. And Ciaran's fried, so unfortunately, Lisa, you have to go first to pad for time.
We didn't give him enough coffee at the beginning of the day.
I know. We were remiss in that, but cappuccino stat.
Yeah, please.
I think for me, actually, what sort of came through our discussion at the beginning and then throughout the two awesome presentations that we had was that ultimately it always comes back to the same thing, which is human beings, and how we interact with technology is the crucial point at which things can go very, very wrong or very, very right, depending on how you do it. So for me, I think that feeling of, you can't let yourself become complacent. You have to always train the human beings that are interacting with the technology, be it security professionals, be it the board, be it, your employees and your user base. And I think that's really the key takeaway that seems to go across every single industry and every single type of security and technology.
For me, I've had a second to think. It's probably, from both presentations, it's about doing the doable. Mm-hmm. Neither of these experts from the opposite sides of the world came up and tried to pull off that old stunt that we see time and time again in our business of, look, I've got a magic wand. In fact, they both explicitly said that they didn't. But instead, in their own way, in their own tone, they sort of said, look, here's a bunch of things. And Stephen, he said, look, you can only mitigate, but then if you did everything he said, you get quite a long way in mitigating things, and you'd have to be quite unlucky for a complete disaster to afflict you. And in Terrence's, it was kind of the same. It was like, a bunch of hard stuff here, and you might not be able to do it all, but if you do quite a lot of it and understand why you're doing it, then again, you'll get quite a long part of the way. So I think, it was the anti-hype, but, that sort of incremental pragmatism, all these dreadful words that people normally hate, but they're really powerful and they're really important. And I think you just take that pragmatic, practical, doable, do the doable. That was my takeaway from today.
Limiting the blast radius.
Limiting the blast radius.
I really like that. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, doing the doable. I'm a big fan of that. And look, I think it's interesting. I mentioned that concept earlier of we're in the golden age. We've never had more technology, more controls. I mean, you look at the power of these cloud platforms. I talked to a CISO recently who said, I think we're using about 1% of our cloud platform's capabilities. I don't know if that's good or bad. And doing the doable, making use of the tools that are now in our environment for good, not evil, I think is something we all could spend a minute focusing on. But I'll underline, some of the stuff's quite different to 10 years ago.
Yep.
Doing the doable isn't what it used to be. I mean, you take a standard cybersecurity practitioner and put them into a cloud environment and say, do security. And they look at that cloud security console and PowerShell and the other tools and look pretty confused and baffled. There's quite a lot of evolution of the skills required to use that technology to do the doable. So we should all step back and look at, I think, what it takes to do that in our environments and what we can meaningfully apply from today.
Absolutely right.
Wonderful. Well, with that, it falls to me to wrap up here. Just a couple of things. First and foremost, I mentioned it at the beginning of the day: feedback. We do want it, both in the room and from you. It's hugely important. Oh, look, we've got loads of. We're going to click through all of these slides again, just in case you didn't like them the first time. There we go. Fantastic. So feedback, as I mentioned, is hugely important. If you love these topics, we'd love to hear about it. If you thought they had wonderfully actionable advice, if you like the studio retort, the back and forth, the match of the day format, we'd like to hear about that too. But perhaps most important, what are you worrying about that we're not covering? What are the kind of top things that ought to be on the agenda for our next virtual session? Who do you really want to hear from? What horror stories can we help you avoid? Those are things we want to hear in the feedback session, in the feedback form. So please take a little bit of time to do that. With that, I want to thank again our studio guests, Ciaran and Lisa, and our speakers, Stephen and Terrence, for their wonderful contribution. And I am wishing you a breach-free time between now and our next broadcast. We'll see you on the network live for some further discussion. Have a fantastic rest of day, everyone. Cheerio.